Well, thank you. In particular, thank you to have me here to discuss about DevOps. Again, the topic of my conversation today is really about why DevOps tools can't deliver value. And so let me start off by at least briefing everyone on the concept of DevOps for those who aren't as familiar with it. So DevOps is really a combination of the word development and the word operations. And it really is meant to talk about how do we reduce the friction between development and operations as it relates to the software development lifecycle. And over a period of time, DevOps has also been really a view of how do we automate that software development lifecycle so that there's much more efficiency, much more speed going through the system. But again, it's not about the tools that deliver value. So how we've approached this at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Rhode Island is you really need to fall in love with the problem and not the solution. In this case, DevOps is the solution, but it's not the actual problem we were trying to solve. We originally thought our problem related a lot to a lot of the inaccurate testing environments that we had, whether it was the development, the SIT, and the UAT. Hopefully something you all can appreciate as far as the environments you probably deal with. And so that was our premise, is we're having issues with our testing environments. So we went and actually spoke with all the various people that are involved in managing the test environments, whether it's developers, development managers, operations people, subject matter experts. In the context of when I talk about operations, part of the context of that operations is the quality assurance organization. I actually happen to run both the business analyst and the quality analyst here at Blue Cross of Rhode Island. And what we heard is we actually had these conversations, and very open-ended conversations is really around there were way too many handoffs and too much manual work that was happening. And that really led to us to really isolate what the problem was. We heard that all of our tools were old and needed modernization. We had a set of existing automated regression suite, and when we actually started to dig into it, we realized that it wasn't as automated as we thought. And our release management process wasn't as flexible as we needed it to be. And I'll give you scenarios. When we started talking about this whole problem, we also started looking at Agile as far as moving from a waterfall to an Agile process. And what we determined is there was no way we can start adopting Agile, whether it's Scrum, Kanban, or extreme programming, you name it. There was no way we could start adopting that without solving this problem first. And, if we can't have a flexible release management process, for example, then we couldn't deploy code at the end of a sprint. So really what we ended up really focusing in on is how do we drive efficiencies throughout the software development lifecycle. And here we talk about really a fool and his tool are soon departed. DevOps is really around software engineering culture, and it's a culture change. And that's what's critical here is tools do not change a culture. You really need to focus on the people, the process, and then the technology in order to orchestrate a really, truly remarkable culture change. And again, culture is also not an overnight, changing a culture is not an overnight activity. It is a multi-year journey that begins with a first step, and it needs to be also a roadmap of conversations. Really, you can't do everything at once. You really need to have a roadmap over multiple years of how to continually transform that culture to an ideal state that you've identified. And that's what we did, is we actually sat down and talked about what are the end state behaviors we expect from anyone inside of IT. Automation is really critical to that, but also we focused on things like zero waste, not having waste in the system. You know, if you have a wasteful process and you automate it, it's still a wasteful process. We looked at things like be data driven, right? As we make decisions and we need to, as we try and make decisions, we need data to help tell us what those decision points should be, and then we can manage and measure moving forward from a metrics perspective. We also looked at how does leadership play a role in changing a culture, in changing it as far as clearing roadblocks. And for those who are in an agile practice, even things like the servant leadership aspect of agile. And we talk about agile being one of our critical behaviors, but it's not the extent of you're using agile to execute your projects, that you have an agile mindset, that you are allowed to think through problems, that you are allowed to focus clearly and dedicated on the problem that you have at hand, and that you can test and learn. So we actually documented a lot of these behaviors of the culture that we are driving towards that will really help us focus in on that organizational culture change that we needed to make in order to bring the biggest value to our members. And really, at the end of the day, when you think about culture change, it really is demonstrated at the top leadership. So a lot of our focus, and what I have here on this slide is it's actually something from the Puppet Lab State of DevOps 2017 report. As a side note, their 2018 report should be coming out here shortly if it's not already been done. But what they did is they've actually, over the past 7 or 8 years, they've surveyed organizations repeatedly, really focused on DevOps. And in the 2017 report, they added a couple of extra questions around leadership and how does leadership play a role in top performing organizations. And what they found is, if you look at organizations that do some similar work, and again, similar work was based off of the questions that they asked, they found that organizations that had transformational leaders actually had much better results than others that were pretty much doing the exact same thing. The satisfaction of the people inside that company was much higher than the satisfaction of a similar performing organization. The speed at which they released tools or released their solution to their customers was much greater. It really got down to your transformational leaders are those leaders that can really set the tone. They have that vision, over multiple years. They have that inspirational communication styles that not only inspires but motivates. They have this intellectual stimulation. They love having the conversations with folks about the technology, the process problems. And really, at the end of the day, that stimulation is more about listening than it is talking. They're a very supportive leadership. Again, I mentioned the servant leadership, but that's really what the essence of this is from the culture change perspective. And then there's the aspect of those leaders around the personal recognition, recognizing individuals, making it public, really driving, really talking about how those behaviors meet the goals, how they can demonstrate somebody's individual behaviors and point to how that's improved work quality. And really, at the end of the day, those leaders are what changes the culture. On the flip side, managers, directors, VPs, if they are not demonstrating these behaviors, if they're not spending the time and having the conversations around the DevOps culture and what's needed to be done, then the culture will fail. We spent a lot of time not only talking to the developers and the operations people and quality assurance, the architects, but then we also spent a lot of time very specifically communicating to all the managers of people in the organization, and made sure that they understood what was expected of them, and also shared with individual contributors what they should expect from their leaders. So we started to drive a lot of, maybe at times, some tension, some healthy tension between the individual and their leader, but it was all with a viewpoint of how do we really get this culture to move forward. And again, we spent a good deal of time defining the what and the changes to the process, really to give us the direction on how to get there. So we had some very antiquated processes here, but we really spent a lot of time focused on our release management, our branching strategy from a code perspective, our project delivery lifecycle. What are the changes to how we execute projects that need to happen as you adopt to this DevOps mentality? Code design, code review. Again, most of us are, QA folks at our heart, and really at the end of the day, we focused a lot of our attention on how do you design better code. Now that's not anything to do with tools. It really is about how to effectively design your code. I always joke about it is if you still have poorly designed code, with DevOps, it's just going to make it through the pipeline quicker. But at the end of the day, it's still poorly designed code with probably a lot of technical debt associated with it. So code design, code reviews are two sides of the coin as far as making sure not only quality is built in, but also that you're reducing actually your technical debt. You're eliminating it, in fact, if your code design is done correctly. As I mentioned before, we found that our automated regression suite wasn't really automated. And so we spent a lot of time focused on how do we really truly automate our test execution in a way that it actually has a lifecycle management to it. So we developed a whole process around how do you identify test cases that need to be automated? How do you go through and measure that those are being automated? How do you measure to make sure that your automation regression is executing properly and in the time frame that you need it to execute? For example, we also had our test automation suite running over multiple days. And because there were so many handoffs, in the process, and so many stops and starts and human intervention in there. So really the goal was how do we reduce our regression, our automated regression, from taking 3 to 4 days to being run in a 24-hour cycle. And the team just really, once they understood, what the goal is and why we needed to do that, they met it, really flawlessly. And that relates really to the release management structure, that if you want to release more frequently, you can't have a regression that's spending all week, making sure that nothing is wrong. And the other process we changed across the board is just the software development lifecycle. It's just looking at all the elements of that and really changing where it made sense to change those, so that we could drive the efficiencies that we were expecting. So again, a lot of our time was around mapping out current state processes, and then how do we streamline those processes moving forward. And then based off of your people focus, your process focus, we then brought in the tools. So here's really our tool slide. We decided first and foremost that the one tool that we were not going to change in our process was actually Quality Center. So that was the heart and soul of our operations. And after a lot of conversations with different products that are out there that could replace it, we found that we didn't want to change the heart and soul, right, of what we do from not only a QA perspective, but everything that we do. Every developer has a skill set that they know how to use Quality Center. Every QA person knows how to use Quality Center. So it's not a skill set that we wanted to like change, because we were changing almost everything else about a person's life. So we went out and looked at really a lot of open source applications, and then we also looked at how do we use Quality Center in a much more a broader way. So we actually decided also to bring all of our requirements into Quality Center, so that we could have the requirements. We could have test cases against those requirements. We can have test execution. We can have defect management all the way through those requirements for every project. And for the first time ever, we actually had full traceability of requirements from the beginning of the project all the way through execution. So that was really critical for us to have that visibility and start using HP the way, the Quality Center the way it should be. The other open source tools that we brought in were GitLab. So GitLab is really, the code repository. I mean, most developers have a code repository, so bringing in another code repository is not something you really want to do because it causes confusion. But when you actually had to look at every single application and make sure that the applications themselves had the right branching strategy, and that branching strategy could be executed inside of a tool and managed inside of the tool, that's really where GitLab really starts to shine, is really the execution of that branching strategy by applications. Jenkins is really the CI/CD pipeline that really starts to drive a lot of the automation. So it is, as something is ready to be deployed from development into SIT, it's really Jenkins that goes out and does all the automation. And I'll talk a little bit more about Jenkins in a second. The one that I really love is SonarQube. It's such a great tool. SonarQube does static code analysis. So what that really means is it really reviews the way the developer wrote their code and says, how well did you write it against the standards of that code, whether it's a JavaScript and .NET, C++, whatever the case may be. It analyzes that code and tells you, did you write it well or not? And if not, it tells you exactly where in the code that you didn't write it. It suggests ways to change it. It's a really powerful tool to really change those behaviors, again, around that code design, and really helps facilitate also code reviews. We had other tools like Artifactory. We had a whole suite of kind of the XUnit tools, JUnit, SoapUI, and then we also used Selenium. We brought in Selenium for a lot of our automation efforts, particularly around, we're a big Salesforce shop here. So Salesforce is actually, they pretty much say to use Selenium. So we had a combination of Selenium UFT for a lot of our test automations. But really what happens is Jenkins is that engine that drives everything. The way we developed this and deployed it, we have Jenkins that goes and notices that a merge request is needed from a GitLab perspective. It goes, it pulls all those together. It then does a build of that. It's using Ant and Artifactory to help do that build process, and then it goes and does it goes and automates the quality scanning through SonarQube. It then goes in and runs smoke tests. So we actually broke our regression into smoke tests to test the application-specific elements of it. The regression to really test all the interdependencies inside the code, externally to the code. So Jenkins actually calls out to Selenium and does a lot of the smoke test. We actually also go through and do functional testing at the end. Again, manual testing when we need to. The other thing we had Jenkins do, and you might hear some folks reply, really call it DevSecOps, or Development Security Operations. We actually integrated with Jenkins the ability to have a security scan against the code. Again, similar to static code analysis, which will tell you how you develop, in your language of choice. The security scan will actually look at, did you introduce any security vulnerabilities that need to be fixed before you go into production. So Nadeep talked about, the CI/CD pipeline, the continuous integration, continuous development pipeline, and really it is all about Jenkins that would help us really to automate a tremendous amount of work that was all done manually.